Started here. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce our next speaker, Professor Rachel Fulton Brown. She's an associate professor of history at the University of Chicago, the author of From Judgment to Passion, Devotion to Christ and the Virgin Mary, 800 to 1200, and Mary and the Art of Prayer, the Hours of the Virgin in Medieval Christian Life and Thought. She writes for the public as Fencing Bear at Prayer and teaches medieval history on unauthorized.tv. She also has a wonderful lecture class on the Forge of Tolkien that you'll get to see at Unauthorized TV if you check it out. She's had some remarkable experiences in medieval academia, which you'll find chronicled by Milo Yiannopoulos in his book, Middle Rages. And Professor Brown's side of the story you'll find in her book available here, The Milo Chronicles. So without further ado, Professor Brown.
I'm giving you a live experience of what the show is like, so. And then the next one. In those days, the smiths of Ost and Adel surpassed all that they had contrived before, and they took thought and they made rings of power. But Sauron guided their labors, and he was aware of all that they did, for his desire was to set a bond upon the elves and bring them under his vigilance. Now the elves made many rings, but secretly Sauron made one ring to rule all the others. And their power was bound up with it to be subject wholly to it and to last only so long as it too should last. And much of the strength and will of Sauron passed into that one ring, for the power of the elven rings was very great, and that which should govern them must be a thing of surpassing potency, and Sauron forged it in the mountain of fire in the land of shadow. And while he wore the one ring, he could perceive all the things that were done by means of the lesser rings, and he could see and govern the very thoughts of those that wore them. Welcome. I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is the Forge of Tolkien, special episode BasedCon. Question: how did Sauron's ring work? We know it's famous for binding other rings, and that he put his own strength and will into it, and that someone wearing the one ring might see and govern the very thoughts of those that wore the other rings. But how did it work? Well, there's theories. I'm sure some of you have some, and you're going to tell me in question and answer what you think it is. The most famous, the one that Tolkien seemed to have been beset with in answering his letters for most of his later life, was the atomic bomb, of course, right? The Lord of the Rings, he said, well, no. In the foreword to the second edition, he says it wasn't the atomic bomb because, of course, the Lord of the Rings is neither allegorical nor topical. If inspired by the real war in which people used the atomic bomb, quote, the ring would have been seized and used against Sauron. He would not have been annihilated, but enslaved, and Barad-dûr would not have been destroyed, but occupied. Plus, of course, Saruman would have gone to Mordor, found the missing links in his own researches into ring lore, and before long he would have made a great ring of his own with which to challenge the self-styled ruler of Middle-earth. In that conflict, both sides would have held hobbits in hatred and contempt. They would not long have survived even as slaves. So Saruman would have made his own ring, right? Because he would have gone and continued his researches, clue, into ring lore, and he would have been able to make his own, right? And Tolkien says, no, it's not. And a number of his original readers seem to have felt that that was the answer, right? That the ring is somehow a great weapon like the atomic bomb. Well, no, Tolkien insisted. My friend, whom some of you may be familiar with for his dangerous writings, not Milo. I've gone on to even more dangerous people than Milo, can you imagine? Maybe Vox Day, wait, no. Even more dangerous, no, wait. E. Michael Jones, who some may be familiar with from his history, has a little pamphlet that he called Tolkien's Failed Quest. And Mike has told me, he insists, that Tolkien basically never admitted what he was writing about because he's really writing about Wagner's ring. That's another episode. We'll get to that eventually. But in Mike Jones's argument, what the ring represents is, in fact, usury, right? It's the power of, and you get this long version in Mike Jones's Barren Metal, right? It's the power of compound interest on gold, which in effect destroys all commerce and culture and freedom, and that Tolkien, in not acknowledging the fact that he's actually talking about a gold ring, is not acknowledging, well, that problem with the dwarves and who they might represent. But Tolkien, of course, was asked about whether or not he was describing a Wagnerian ring in his life, and he insisted both rings were round and there the resemblance ceases. I do think Michael Jones is right about the power of usury, or the sort of horror of usury, but I do think knows less about magic rings, so I'm not sure usury is the full answer. Another one that is fairly interesting and moderately persuasive to me is in Adam Roberts' The Riddles of the Hobbit, which I do recommend as one of the loveliest explorations of the riddling in the stories. And Roberts suggests, well, look, the ring was a simple gold band. It's modeled on wedding rings, right? So the one ring, as Roberts argues, creates this parody of love, right? It becomes precious to Gollum and to Bilbo and to the others who carry it. It's binding like a marriage vow, and I have done an episode in Forge of Tolkien on letter 43 where Tolkien writes to his son Michael about the meaning of marriage. So Roberts is not off in his understanding that Tolkien was very concerned with the sacrament of marriage, the meaning of the vows, and as he sees it, well, the ring is a wedding ring but put to a sort of malign anti-marriage, right? Like a photographic negative of the positive power of the Blessed Sacrament. Possibly. Perhaps the most famous, if you all read in Tolkien scholarship, Tom Shippey's great book, The Road to Middle-earth. Shippey argued that what the ring represents is addiction. And you could say, well, it's addiction to power, like Lord Acton famously said, although he's actually talking about how power corrupts historians. They fall in love with the powerful when they tell their stories, but the power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Well, of course, the ring is corrupting, and it has, Shippey argues, the sort of characteristics of something you become addicted to that you can't let go of voluntarily, like, I don't know, heroin, right? So, atomic bomb, usury, marriage, addiction. Well, the problem with this theory, these theories, as I see it, is they do not account for the magic in the ring, nor, in fact, for the way in which the other rings worked, right? We have the one ring, but we also have 19 other rings. So this is a story of 20 magic rings. And if we look at the way Tolkien describes the power of those rings, we realize we're actually in a bigger problem of just figuring out what the one ring is, right? The Elvish rings, that's the ring verse if you can't see it. The Elvish rings were made by Celebrimbor, Silverhand, which has some interesting possibilities. And there are three of them, right? The fire ring, Narya, the water ring, Ninya, and the air ring, Vilya. They each have, as he said, they're named the rings of fire, of water, and of air, and they're each set with their own stone, right? So the fire ring has a ruby, the water ring has an adamant, which is a diamond, right? And the air ring has a sapphire, and that it's these elvish rings that Sauron most desired to possess because they have the great powers that they do. Quote, for those who had them in their keeping could ward off the decays of time and postpone the weariness of the world, which is the opposite of the one ring, right? So there's magic in these rings, and we need to understand where it comes from. The dwarvish rings, there's 7 of them, and they do actually fit what Mike Jones argues about usury, right? And that these rings are specifically used for the getting of wealth, right? The dwarves indeed prove tough and hard to tame. They ill endure the domination of others, and the thoughts of their hearts are hard to fathom, nor can they be turned to shadows. They used their rings only for the getting of wealth. But wrath and an overmastering greed of gold were kindled in their hearts, of which evil enough after came to the prophet of Sauron. Those rings fit I mean, they fit for usury. They become the foundation of the dragon hoards, which is topical for one story. But again, they're a subcategory of ring power, and obviously the One Ring is not exactly a dwarf ring. They also have gemstones, but Tolkien seems not to have said what they were, so be that as it may. And then the third category is, of course, the mannish rings. There are 9 of those. Men are easier to get than dwarves. Those who used the 9 rings became mighty in their day, kings and sorcerers and warriors of old. They attained great glory, so that's different. The dwarves just want wealth. The men also want glory, yet it turned to their undoing. They had, as it seemed, unending life, yet life became unendurable to them. They could walk if they would, unseen by all eyes in this world beneath the sun, and they could see things in worlds invisible to mortal men. But too often they beheld only the phantoms and delusions of Sauron. And one by one, sooner or later, according to their native strength and to the good or evil of their wills in the beginning, they fell under the thraldom of the ring that they bore and under the domination of the One, which was Sauron's. And they became forever invisible, save to him that wore the ruling ring, and they entered into the realm of shadows. Now, this is all from the Silmarillion's account of the rings of the Third Age. I put it to you that the mannish rings are the key to what Tolkien was really worried about, and the kinds of powers that the mannish rings have of glory and great wealth, unending life, invisibility, but that they get gradually, depending on their own strength of will, get drawn into Sauron's deceits and illusions, is typical. So remember what it said in The Hobbit. Can you see any of these? Okay, I'll just tell you what they are and you'll know. That's Bilbo in front of Smaug on his dragon hoard, right? And in the Tolkien's drawing, Bilbo is invisible because he has the ring on. Remember what it said in The Hobbits about Gollum's ring. And don't please start on me with the 1937 versus the 1951 version. I know, right? We can talk about that as well. But because the game that they go through, Gollum and Bilbo go through in the earlier version is different from the later. But the point of the ring is, it's a ring of power, right? When Bilbo stumbles on it, it's a ring of power, and if you slip that ring on your finger, you were invisible. But who knows how Gollum came by that present ages ago in the old days when such rings were still at large in the world. Tolkien is still originally working within this idea that rings are out there. Gollum found one, Bilbo gets it in the riddle game, story carries on to get the dragon, right? Gollum's ring was originally simply a fairy tale ring, a magic ring like you find in the old tales. Old tales, for example, like The Dragon of the North, published by Andrew Lang in the Yellow Fairy book in 1894. Therefore, definitely one that Tolkien read growing up, right? And he references all of Andrew Lang's collection in his famous essay on fairy stories, but this one came out the year after, 2 years after Tolkien was born, so it's certainly one that he could have read in his childhood. In this story, there's a magic ring kept by a witch maiden in a little gold box on a silver table, which the hero needs in order to slay a dragon. Now, he's a bad guy and he tricks her and she ends up imprisoning him at the end because he's a bad guy, but what she says to him when he comes to her and she's like, here's my treasure, she says, "Here is my greatest treasure, whose like is not to be found in the whole world. It is a precious gold ring. When you marry me, I will give you this ring as a marriage gift, and it will make you the happiest of mortal men." So it's a gold ring, and she says it's precious, and it's a marriage ring. This ring, she explains to him, is inscribed with secret signs. And she says, no mortal is able entirely to understand the power of this ring, because no one thoroughly understands the secret signs carved upon it. But even with my half knowledge, I can work great wonders. She seems to know only what to do with her left hand. The little finger of the left hand, you put the ring on, you can fly like a bird. The third finger of the left hand, you become invisible, able to see everything that passes around me, though no one can see me. The middle finger of the left hand, neither fire nor water nor sharp weapon could hurt the bearer. The forefinger of the left hand, you could make things like buildings, some magic building ability. craftsmanship. And the thumb of the left hand, you could break rocks and walls with your bare hand. You could figure out how he steals it from her when he persuades her to give it to him. But the witch maiden was unable to interpret the other signs, and she says no doubt it contains secrets of great importance. Most importantly, she explains, the ring formerly belonged to King Solomon, the wisest of kings, during whose reign the wisest men lived. But it is not known, she says, whether this ring was ever made by mortal hands. It is supposed that an angel gave it to the wise king. Well, what's in a ring? And this is the one I'm sorriest you can't see because it's a Weta ring, and it's $4,500 if you want to buy it. One day you'll see these. We'll put them up, right, so you can see. It's very important, I think, in Tolkien's stories that the rings are real rings. Material objects with power, not just symbols or allegories, as Tolkien would say. He's always adamant about that the materiality, the physicality of his world matters, and that is part of the point of the magic. It's necessary, and this I go into in enormous detail in my Forge of Tolkien, and we're talking about the Forge of Tolkien, you realize. Necessary to Tolkien's understanding of creation, that it's not Neoplatonic, although some of my colleagues have argued so, that, in that everything emanates from the one. When Iluvatar proposes the music to the Ainur and they sing it, and it, manifests out into this creation, it's in a Neoplatonic understanding, that emanation, the things that are further away from the one are less real, right? But our created reality is utterly real. I like what you were saying this morning. It's like it matters that it's real, and Tolkien would agree, right? It's not just a symbol or an allegory, and it's not less real than the one. Neither, of course, is it Manichaean, so that matter is itself evil, right? And that those are two problems, right? Either matter is less real and we're actually just in an illusion, or engaged in the material world, we are trapped in evil. Neither of these would Tolkien support, because he is ultimately Catholic in his metaphysics. Tolkien was worried not about mere materiality and escaping it, but about the misuse of creation, right? Not about making or subcreation as such, but about the way in which we as makers, made in the image and likeness of a maker, can put that making to evil uses, right? Tolkien was also thinking very hard about what making means, that Sauron put his own will and energy into the ring. He made something, a work of art, a mechanism, which means we should be asking about the tradition of making magic rings, not just looking for symbolism. A brief history of English magic. Next slide. And this one's the other one that I'm really sorry you can't see, because it's me at the Renaissance Fair with a magic rat on my shoulder. No, it wasn't my rat. It was one of the performers' rats. There is a reason that Renaissance fairs, like the one we have in Bristol and Wisconsin, right north of Chicago, are filled with wizards and fairies, presided over by the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I. I used to think this was a problem, because of course Protestants didn't like wizards and fairies. Certainly James I and VI didn't. They were the ones who were busy hunting the witches. Well, again, as Travis very helpfully told you, it never hurts to read more. Keep going. Queen Elizabeth, this is...
Elizabeth and John Dee.
And John Dee. Do you know what John Dee's call name was? 007. Queen Elizabeth was not just the title character in Edmund Spenser's great allegorical poem, The Fairy Queen. She was also the patroness of a network of wizards and magicians, also known as mathematicians, astronomers, and natural philosophers, presided over for a time by her erstwhile childhood tutor and allegedly spy, the alchemist and Christian Kabbalist John Dee. You know, if you know that he's who said that? If you know he's 007, you know, for example, that he travels to Prague with Edward Kelly, has conversations with angels. The 007 is like eyes plus a lucky number 7. And he did sign his letters that way, so that's where the James Bond allegedly comes from. He also allegedly coined the term British Empire, certainly encouraged Elizabeth in her, ambitions in expanding the powers of England, and encouraged her to found colonies. He was also potentially the model for Shakespeare's great wizard Prospero of Tempest fame. Which is why it's very appropriate, like we're out here in the sun, right, in our performance. Most important for our purposes, however, was his personal library at Mortlake, purportedly the largest in England at the time. He had thousands of books to which he gave access to the scholars of his day. And the great scholar of our day who wrote about this is Frances Yates. She describes the collection as the library of a man of the Renaissance, bent on assimilating the whole realm of knowledge available in his time. He wrote, for example, a preface to Henry Billingsley's translation of Euclid. His collection included history and literature. It included some of the more daring Italians like Pico della Mirandola. And, most important for our purposes, several copies of Cornelius Agrippa's De Occulta Philosophia Libris Tres. I'm glad you know it. The great three-part textbook of Renaissance humanist occultism. Why does this matter for our understanding of the One Ring? Well, thanks to Dee, everybody read Agrippa, possibly or not possibly Tolkien. I'll get to that in a second. And in reading Agrippa, they get an access to a particular understanding of magic, which has this structure to it. The outline to Dee's preface of the translation of Euclid is based on Agrippa's division of the universe into three worlds. There's the natural or elemental world, there's the celestial or mathematical world, which involves the planets, right? So the astronomical, and the supercelestial or angelic, right? So you have the natural world, the mathematical world, and the angelic world. Agrippa was also Dee's main guide in his seances with Kelly, talking with angels, during which, intriguingly, Dee gained access to the language in which the angels themselves speak, so-called Enochian. You can go into that too. When I talk about the Anilindule, and you realize you're talking about angels all the time with Tolkien. I cannot find evidence that Tolkien actually read Agrippa. There's good scholarship now on his library and on his sources, and nobody seems to have picked up on that. But Tolkien definitely read Spenser's Faerie Queene and compared Spenser favorably to Shakespeare. What that means, right? But we know Tolkien is a scholar of literature, and he's definitely familiar with Spenser, and he's it's in their curriculum at Oxford, and he's definitely familiar with Shakespeare. And I have some more details of evidence about. We have one copy of the Faerie Queene that, in fact, is annotated by Tolkien. He mentions in the Notion Club papers on the first night. This is getting deep into Tolkieniana, right? After that's frankly had read a poem, later read again, called the Canticle of Artegall, they all parted. And Artegall is, of course, the main character in Book 5 of the Faerie Queene. So Tolkien has Faerie Queene on his mind. And he mentions in his letter to Milton Waldman how, in thinking about elves, he, quote, intended the word to be understood in its ancient meanings, which continued as late as Spenser, a murrain on Will Shakespeare and his damned cobwebs. Right? So if we're thinking elvish, Tolkien is thinking in Spenserian terms, and Spenser and Elizabeth and Dee and Agrippa are all part of this same conversation. Ma'am,
I'm sorry, can you briefly touch on what that means?
Which? Okay. Which bit?
The Spenser elves versus whatever came after the Spenser elves.
So the Spenser elf, the Faerie Queene is this high allegorical poem. I mean, I've listened to the whole thing in audiobook, and I can't tell you what's in it, right? Because it's meant to be an allegory of the virtues, and the most famous character in it is the Red Cross Knight in the first one, and his character is Chastity, and he goes through a variety of adventures, and he ends up having to fight a dragon, right? So I know a children's book, Trina Shard-Hyman did a beautiful children's book version of that one. So the stories are familiar already, but the thing that Spenser was doing with his allegory was like deeply embedding all of this sort of occult wisdom into his representation of Elizabeth as the Faerie Queene, right? That the characters in the Faerie Queene are meant to be serving her, Astrea, right? And so if you go to Renaissance fairs, which maybe some of you may have, that the sort of flavor of our modern acting in those fairs is in that Spenserian mode of Elizabeth as Faerie Queene, and the Bristol one they'll have people dressed up as woodland sprites and things like that. And Tolkien is saying those fairies are more robust and more what he means by elves than the Shakespearean fairies, although the Shakespearean fairies are in fact, like Oberon and Titania and Midsummer Night's Dream, are actually robust fairy characters too. And Prospero definitely is a powerful sorcerer character. So I think when Tolkien's saying that, he's thinking more of Mercutio's speech in Romeo and Juliet. Did that go too far? Okay. It matters, but not all. What it is that we're in the right flavor world, right? You will not be surprised, I hope, to learn that Agrippa has instructions on how to make a magic ring. Unfortunately, you can't see. There's no pictures. It's just text, so I'll read it, right? This is Book 1, Chapter 47 of Rings and Their Compositions. Rings also, which were always much esteemed of by the ancients. Oh, I'll just stand on it. That's good. Rings also, which were always much esteemed of by the ancients. I'm talking about making magic rings and all our tech fails. When they are opportunely made, do in like manner impress their virtue upon us, inasmuch as they do affect the spirit of him that carries them with gladness or sadness, and render him courteous or terrible, bold or fearful, amiable or hateful, inasmuch as also they do fortify against sickness, poison, evils, poisons, enemies, evil spirits, and all manner of hurtful things, or at least will not suffer us to be kept under them. Now the manner of making these rings is this. Namely, when any star ascends fortunately with the fortunate aspect or conjunction of the moon, we must take a stone and herb that is under that star and make a ring of the metal that is suitable to this star, and in it fasten the stone, putting the herb or root under it, not omitting the inscriptions of images, names, and characters, and also the proper suffumigations. But we shall speak more of these in another place, where we shall treat of images and characters. Okay, so rings were real objects made of metal with gemstones, but they were also inscribed with images, names, and characters. Are we back on?
We're on.
Okay, next. How to make a magic ring. I don't see any picture. Somebody doesn't want us to know about how to make these rings. One, that's okay, we can't see it. Hopefully we can show you the slide. Oh, there you go. These are actually real magic rings. They're in the Victoria and Albert collection in London, and they're made with toadstones, right? So these are real ones. Okay, next slide. Oh, stop. I don't have the full catalog of all the stones. No, the toadstones, right? Yeah, and I do have my Agrippa. I'll get it later, and we can go through. No, what was fun about this is the modern translation of the Agrippa is like this, because he's got all these footnotes and everything. And as I was trying to figure out the recipe that I'm about to give you, I was feeling like I'm one of these guys trying to put together the recipe, because I just read you everything that Agrippa tells you about making the ring. So what then you have to do is, well, do all of this work, right? So he's given you the instructions. How do you do it? 1, identify the star under which you wish to work. Say, for example, if you want to speak well, I didn't make one. Mercury, right? And the planets count as stars in this understanding. Choose the right metal. For Mercury, that would be silver, tin, or yellow brass. Choose the right gemstone and herb for the virtue you want to have. And there are, in fact, lots of these to choose from for Mercury. Quote, amongst the stones, emeralds, agates, red marble, topaz, and those which are of diverse colors. And those that are artificial is glass, and those which have a color mixed with yellow and green. You have to have your right plant, too. Amongst plants, the herb mercury, fumitory, pimpernel, marjoram, parsley, and such as have shorter and less leaves, being compounded of mixed natures and diverse colors. You then would have to inscribe the ring with the right images, names, and characters, which are shown on screen, potentially, and burn incense. For Mercury, you would take mastic, frankincense, cloves, and the herb cinquefoil, and the stone acates, and incorporate them all with the brain of a fox, or a weasel, and the blood of a magpie. And there you...
What about cinquefoil? Didn't they have medicinal properties? Seems to me it's almost similar to...
Cinquefoil
See?
is related to barrenness. There's probably some growing here in the yard.
We will have a workshop later.
We're going to make a ring of power.
You guys think about it. Okay. So yes, I mean, and the thing is, this is the kind of learning that was fascinating to, this is the natural philosophy level of everything, that you're understanding the properties of the material world, the elemental world, right? And this is a deep tradition. There's magical handbooks like this that go back into antiquity. Okay, so we have Agrippa giving you the instructions, but this goes all the way back to the ancients. Okay, so that's my recipe, and there you have a ring that will imbue you with the virtues of Mercury, I think. Properly inscribed, the table of Mercury, quote, renders the bearer thereof grateful and fortunate to do what he pleaseth. It bringeth gain and prevents poverty, conduces to memory, good for speaking, right? Understanding and divination, and to the understanding of occult things by dreams. We'll get there, because how is it working, right? Dare we try to figure out how Sauron made his ring? This one glows. We know it was gold and inscribed with a charm. I won't say it in the black speech, but one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. It definitely helped that this charm was written in the alphabet, devised by Fëanor. Can we count volcanic fumes as fumigations? I'm not positive. We are told in Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings only that Sauron forged the One Ring in Orodruin sometime around the year 1600 at the end of the Second Age. And Elrond described how Celebrimbor was aware of him when Sauron forged the ring. Possibly when Sauron spoke the charm. It's not said. The ring's principal virtue was that it revealed the things done by means of the other rings and could govern the very thoughts of those that wore them. It also, we learned that it has other powers. For example, Sam can understand the orcs when they're talking while he's wearing the ring. Frodo's voice becomes commanding when he speaks to Gollum. The ring extends life, but the wearer becomes a wraith, permanently invisible. The ring corrupts those who try to wield or possess it. And we know that the ruling ring contains the powers of all the others. But also could abandon its bearer, so it falls off Bilbo's finger at times. Also, it was made in effect by an angel, albeit a fallen one, right? This Sauron is an angel. I know you don't think of him necessarily like that. Modern sorcerer Clifford Hartley Lowe has.
You said Sauron was?
Sauron was an angel.
So
Like Gandalf.
Gandalf was angel, but Saruman was in the same.
Sauron was an angel.
So,
He's like, so is Melkor, right? They're angels, and Sauron was originally Melkor's servant, and so Sauron was originally also one of these angelic beings of some character, right? So it's, sorry? The Balrog's also an angel. Yeah, so they're angelic beings in the stories, and Sauron is basically an angel. Remember, that's where the witch maiden got her ring, right? An angel gave it to King Solomon. So modern sorcerer, I wondered whether anybody had tried, right? And I found Clifford Hartley Lowe suggests that Tolkien may have used Agrippa's description of the solar gemstone heliotrope as the basis for Sauron's ring. But Sauron's ring famously had no gemstone, so I'm not quite sure how Lowe makes this argument. He does make magic rings, and he says he made one with this heliotrope. He gave a recipe with the results that he said, well, I feel healthier and more vigorous than I have in years. And the analytics show that my online presence is undergoing an incredible spike in attention from around the world. I think this was left off of the previous panel. How to get more attention. And he claims that it was from he doesn't have an explanation for it other than the ring. I think it more likely that Tolkien was inspired by actual 16th century rings like this one. which if you could see it, you would see it looks like our modern wedding bands, and it's inscribed. And these are famous, this is also from the Victoria and Albert collection. They're called posy rings because they have a poesy. They have an inscription on them. This one says, "My worldly joy and all my trust, heart, thought, life, and lust." So they are love rings or wedding rings, and my suspicion is that Tolkien more likely has in mind a ring like this. How did such magic rings work? Well, then we're actually asking, how does magic work? Agrippa and Dee both insisted that the magic they were working was Christian. But what did that mean? Well, as I mentioned, it was grounded in a long tradition of educated magic going back to antiquity, newly stimulated in the 15th and 16th centuries by Christian study of the Kabbalah by humanists like Giovanni Pico della Mirandola and Johannes Reuchlin. It requires a particular view of the world as a creature made by God, right? Even more importantly, a creature ordered hierarchically and including both terrestrial, earthly, and celestial heavenly beings. As Agrippa explained in the opening to his threefold philosophy, and this is actually important, this is the entire mechanism is described in the opening paragraph of Agrippa. Quote, "Seeing there is a threefold world, elementary, celestial, and intellectual, and every inferior is governed by its superior, and receiveth the influence of the virtues thereof, so that the very original and chief worker of all doth by angels, the heavens, stars, elements, animals, plants, metals, and stones, convey from himself the virtues of his omnipotency upon us, for whose service he made and created all these things." It's not really sympathetic, and it's not Neoplatonic either. It's this infusion of the reality into the whole creation on all of these different levels. Wise men conceive it in no way irrational that it should be possible for us to ascend by the same degrees through which each world to the very original world itself, the maker of all things, the first cause, from which all things are and proceed, and also to enjoy not only these virtues, which are already in the more excellent kind of things, but also beside these to draw new virtues from above. End quote. So magic, as they understand it in the 16th century, is a technique of tapping into this hierarchy, ascending from the natural world of the four elements, earth, water, air, and fire, to the celestial world of mathematics, numbers, geometry, music, and astronomy, thus the planets and the stars, to the intellectual world of religion, the divine names, angels, and demons. Now, this sounds like the great chain of being, but that phrase is, in fact, an 18th century description of this understanding. And that phrase itself is far more popular in the 20th century than it ever was in the past. But it's this hierarchy. Think of it, I think, better as the hierarchy. The most powerful magic came from the top through the divine name. Christian Kabbalists like Pico and Reuchlin would demonstrate this power through the name Yod-He-Vav-He, transformed into Jesus by way of Shin, so they drop an S in the middle, and saying that inserting that consonant into the middle of the tetragrammaton makes the world audible, therefore incarnate, therefore speakable. There's great emphasis on writing the divine names, and this is showing you some of, in Agrippa's book he has, and you can get the PDF online. I got this one from, I'm sorry?
It's also Gawain's Pinnacle.
Yes. Okay. So there's an incarnational element to being able to speak the word. Yes, thank you. And writing the names is incarnational too, right? It's a materialization of the word. Writing is therefore very, very powerful in this system. Particularly writing the divine names, whether in Hebrew or other alphabets. I told you John Dee believed he had access to the language of angels through his seances with Edward Kelly, so the angelic language matters greatly here. Agrippa included pages and pages of angelic names with corresponding commutations of letters and numbers, along with alternate alphabets. And this one is, if you could see, I'll be able to, come find me in my iPad later, right? And I can show you all these pictures. That there's a ring inscribed with the divine names of one of Agrippa's designs. This all sounds really good, right? And show the next picture. This is a famous set of engravings from Robert Flood's 17th century book, but it's showing you, one, the hierarchy, and two, the sort of way in which this hierarchy is manifested in the mind as well, that you ascend from knowledge of the natural world through the senses to the mathematical world in your mathematical understanding, and then to the intellectual world, the knowledge of God, right? So if this sounds all great and Christian, right? And we know Tolkien is worried about being Christian. Why wasn't Tolkien more explicit about how to make those magic rings? He had the fancy alphabets. He had the names of angels. He had the making of the elements, which is what the Silmarillion, the Ainulindale is about. He had the numbers. And yet, just as he's always saying it's not the atomic bomb, he's also constantly insisting that he's not really given a proper understanding of why he talks about magic. He says in a letter to Naomi Mitchinson that he was far too casual about magic. And he tried there to say, well, there's a difference between magia and goetia, the latter usually meaning sorcery, but he says, oh, well, no, it's sort of different in effect, right? He claims that goetia is more about illusion, but that's not. The OED says goetia is witchcraft or magic performed by the invocation and employment of evil spirits, necromancy. Tolkien's hedging. Why? And it's interesting trying to figure out exactly what Tolkien meant by magic, right? Because he really never talked about it. He articulates all sorts of other things that he works through in his incarnational understanding of the elves and his problem with free will, and he argues about, whether Frodo could have resisted the ring and so forth. But explaining exactly what he thought was the magic in the rings, he hedges. On fairy stories, he makes a distinction between enchantment, which he says produces a secondary world into which both designer and spectator can enter to the satisfaction of their senses while they are inside, but in its purity is artistic and desire and purpose. So he's really mainly worried about enchantment in his storytelling, right? Versus magic, which he says produces or pretends to produce an alteration in the primary world, like actually acts on our material experience. It does not matter by whom it is said to be practiced, fey or mortal. It remains distinct from the other two. It's not an art. Magic is not an art, but a technique. Its desire is power in this world, domination of things and wills. And in another of his letters, in his letter to Milton Waldman, he explicitly links magic with machines, right? He thinks of them as techniques, he says the machine is our more obvious modern form. They're more closely related to magic than is usually recognized. So what's magic? Magic in the modern Western tradition is not opposed to technology or science. Magic is technology and science. The problem with magic is therefore the problem with modernity, therefore the problem with the Enlightenment. The desire for control, and not just over nature, the natural world, but also over the celestial and intellectual worlds, over people's bodies, minds, and souls. Just ask the Numenorians. You all know the Numenorians, right? I got to this part when I was telling my husband, he's like, I don't want to hear about the Numenorians. You need to know about the Numenorians. After the fall of Morgoth and the end of the First Age, they were given a special island filled with beautiful flowers and trees, good harbors, and noble horses. There they also found metals for mining and smithying, and they made beautiful things out of gold, silver, and jewels. But they became greedy of wealth and power, and one day their king, Ar-Pharazôn, challenged Sauron the Great, who humbled himself at the might and splendor of the Numenorian navy and allowed himself to be brought back to the island a prisoner. This is all backstory to The Lord of the Rings, right? You need to read the appendices. But Sauron lied and bewitched the king with the thought that he might challenge the Valar and sail against the band, and Ar-Pharazôn listened to him and brought about the downfall of his kingdom and the drowning of Numenor. Your basic Atlantis story. Which gives us our final clue, I think, to where Tolkien's understanding of magic comes from. More or less the same time as Shakespeare was writing his play about Prospero and his wizardry, give or take a decade, a certain Francis Bacon, not to be confused with Shakespeare, thank you, was busy writing what the internet often calls the earliest science fiction story. You thought we were talking about fantasy. Posthumously published in 1626 at the back of a longer natural history called the Silva Silvarum Forest of Materials. That was told. Well, I'll show you the pictures later. But we're a few more slides forward to. That's Numenor. That's Francis Bacon. That's the New Atlantis. The story was set on an island far to the west of Peru, in the Pacific Ocean, happened upon by a ship of European sailors. The European visitors are given a tour of the island, including its magnificent college or Solomon's house, where the islanders conduct experiments into the workings of the natural world. In the various houses of their college, they do experiments on meteors and rain, the cure of diseases, cultivation of orchards and gardens, breeding of animals, fish, worms, and bees, baking and brewing machines, and mathematics. They have furnaces of great heat and gemstones of great beauty, a sound house for conducting experiments in harmony and speech, an engine house for experimenting with fireworks and machines, even a perfume house for testing taste and smell. Think an industrial kitchen alongside a university, alongside a fully equipped research lab. This is Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, right? Is this magic or science? Is there a difference between the two? Well, I give you, don't go forward yet, a closer description of one of the places where they're doing these experiments. For example, the guide of the Europeans who've been taken, this is Solomon's house, right? The Solomonic wisdom is an incredibly important part of this long tradition of understanding where knowledge comes from and through whom, right? Through the temple tradition. But here we have Solomon's house of experiments, and this is what the guide says about the vision houses, right? The perspective houses. We have also perspective houses where we make demonstrations of all lights and radiations, and of all colors, and of all things uncolored and transparent. We can represent unto you all several colors, not in rainbows as it is in gems and prisms, but of themselves single. We represent also all multiplications of light, which we carry to great distance and make so sharp as to discern small points and lines. Also all colorations of light, all delusions and deceits of the sight, in figures, magnitudes, motions, colors, all demonstrations of shadows. We also have houses of deceits of the senses, where we represent all manner of feats and of juggling, false apparitions, impostures, and illusions and their fallacies. And surely you will easily believe that we have so many things truly natural which induce admiration, could in a world of particulars deceive the senses, if we would disguise those things and labor to make them seem more miraculous. But we hate all impostures and lies, inasmuch as we have severely forbidden it to all our fellows, even though they're doing the experiments, under pain of ignominy and fines, that they do not show any natural work or thing adorned or swelling, but only pure as it is and without all affectation of strangeness. These are, my son, the riches of Solomon's house. You will recall that the witch maiden told the knight that her ring once belonged to King Solomon and that it was believed to have been given to him by an angel, but then so were the secrets of metalworking and medicine. What is the One Ring? This is another of the Posey rings. This one is inscribed in Latin, in French. A time will come on the outside and on inside, my longing keeps me awake. The One Ring is magic. The magic we use to control our world and each other through our knowledge of nature and mathematics and words. I've kept you all sitting in the sun for ages. I'm really sorry you're going to be sunburned. You will remember this lesson. Magic works because creation is a hierarchy. The problem with magic is it is a misuse of the hierarchy of nature, mathematics, and angels to bind and dominate others' wills rather than to give thanks to the Creator. But it works because the hierarchy is real. Tolkien wanted fairy stories to re-enchant the world. He wanted the stories to show you this hierarchy, to show you the reality of the beauty of creation. Fairy stories re-enchant because they reveal the hierarchy of creation from angels down to rocks. Magic works because the influences pass up and down the hierarchy. And the problem that we're faced with, therefore, in Sauron's ring is the difference between the angelic subcreation that the Ainur participate in when they create Arda, make Arda, and we participate in as artists. This is the major theme of my Forge of Tolkien, right? The way we as storytellers and artists and movie makers participate in the subcreation. But the danger is, of course, that it can go to the desire for dominating other wills. The reenchantment of fairy relies on the reality of the material effects of making, not just on the allegory of the soul, which is why Tolkien always resists that allegorizing, right? But it relies on understanding that the material and the nature mathematics and our intellect are in a single hierarchy. Any questions? No, I won't do that. Here I have a final picture, which unfortunately is completely lost on you. The alchemist in his study then and now. Do you recognize the man on the left?
Oh, I can see.
Who is it?
Peter Jackson?
Yes. He's an alchemist. Well, good. But he's an alchemist in Francis Bacon's understanding, right? He's making these illusions, right? He's created an entire workshop to make illusions that deceive the senses. But we don't do that because we're good magicians.
What are we to make of the numerological sequence of rings within the hierarchy that were created, the 1, 3, 7, 9?
It's in the usual, the thing is, I don't know, right, because all of those in the Pythagorean system have significances, right? And you could say if it's 3, it's got to be a trinity, but I don't think Tolkien never wants his allegory to be that on the nose, although I do think he's working within this sort of broader systemic understanding. So 5, I would say 7, no, he doesn't have 5, he has 7. That's in the Pythagorean, it's a 3 and a 4, so it's a perfect spiritual material.
7 was also associated with dwarves and alchemy, so...
You probably have people in the audience that can answer that question better than I can. But this is what's interesting, that even though Tolkien is working in this sort of flavor of this fairy, because he reads Spenser enough, and he's within the English literary tradition sufficiently deeply that it's there, but it's like he always pulled away from actually making the ring. Is curious, right? He never tells you how Sauron did it, or even that when he made the inscription, that's when the power was activated. He doesn't do anything that overt in his description of the process, which is interesting in the scholarship. Almost nobody is. I wanted to give you guys something new. This is completely new and special and specific to today. That the one person I could find talking about Tolkien and Agrippa was the sorcerer who said he tried to make the ring and I think got it wrong because he put a stone in it. Right, so. I'm sorry, S-P-E and S-E-R, Edmund. Yeah.
Sorry, I'll follow up on that. Where's the 5 rings?
There aren't 5. I misspoke. Why aren't there 5? There's 1, 3, 7, and 9.
I'll be autistic here for a minute. There's 1, there's 3, there's 7, there's 9.
Where are the 5? Yeah. But I don't know. We can figure this out.
I have always wondered, suppose Sauron had gotten hold of the One Ring, what precisely would have been the powers that he would have gained?
It's domination over everyone's wills, right? And that's why the magical part of it is at that intellectual level that he can then...
So he could have controlled Aragorn, for example.
Yes, but the modern analog is advertising, right? No, it essentially isn't. There are memes out there of me saying stuff like this, but the power to dominate other wills comes through the imagination and comes through the intellect, right? And so everything that we are being shown in the movies, we are being shown on our magic screens. That's why Jackson is the best analog to the ancient, the 17th century alchemist, because he has, and Hollywood has created this world that we now believe in and is real, and it's dominating our wills. But it's I think Sauron would work like that. So it's interesting. The most powerful version of Tolkien's story we have is this movie.
So you're calling Peter Jackson Sauron?
Saruman, I think.
So,
Yeah.
so you think the overriding theme of Lord of the Rings is beware the powers of control?
Yes, but the problem is they're bound up with the desire to make art. right? It's the subcreation is, and in Mythopoeia, the poem he writes for Lewis to say myths are true, right? He has, we make still by the law in which we're made. We make subcreate, and we have that right as creatures of God, made in the image and likeness of a maker, to make art. But the temptation is to then use it to dominate rather than to praise. Yeah. Oh, yep.
It's always a faux pas during a question session to say a comment, not a question. A comment, not a question. You said one thing that I found quite interesting and I hadn't heard before, which is that metalworking was presented as a gift from God. And I've done blacksmithing for a few years, and there's one Jewish cultural tale that I heard through that, which is apparently in this tale, tongs that a blacksmith uses to hold a piece of work are said to be a gift from God to mankind, with the idea that once you have tongs, you can go ahead and make chisels and hammers and all of these other things.
Right.
But bootstrapping is not at all obvious. How do you make the first set of tongs? So the tale goes that God gave humans tongs.
I didn't know that specifically. The Enochian tradition that Dee is working with, that has some of the sort of backstory of where and this is not necessarily good, right? It's the backstory of Genesis, when the sons of God come down to earth and have children with the daughters of men. But and part of that is the idea they bring with them metalworking and cosmetics. So the weapons of war and weapons women's weapons of illusion, right? Yeah. So that fits with the bigger story.
When you said, so you mentioned that the dwarven rings are the foundation of a dragon horde?
Yes, that's what Tolkien said.
Right, so is that implying that, like, a dragon horde's found, the dragon is hoarding because they have got a ring from the dwarves, or is that just like the idea, the concept?
That the dwarves use them to amass gold, and then the dragons steal the gold from the dwarves. Yeah. So, like, Smaug had... Well, it's interesting because the Smaug's hoard is obviously modeled on the Beowulf dragon's hoard. And in Beowulf, it's a man in the past who has amassed the wealth, and then that attracts a dragon. They're attracted to the gold, and then he sits on it, right? So Smaug obviously grabs his directly by eating the dwarves. But it's the idea that the dwarves use it to amass the treasure, and then the dragon comes and captures it. Yeah.
So you think Tolkien knew of Kelly and Dee and all that relationship? Because I know the story of Kelly and Dee. They're looking through the Showstone, and they're gaining all this knowledge of the Enochian, and he's writing all that stuff down, and they're doing all that. And then in Tolkien, they have the crystal ball that Saruman has, and he calls it this gateway into evil, and you got to be very, very careful. And I'm wondering if he's making that analogy now that you're talking.
Yeah, the Palantiri probably fit in this. Yeah. So it's what I was trying to do is think, where does this magical world that Tolkien's working within come from? And the obvious place is the English tradition of these stories, and therefore it's curious to me. Ronald Hutton has done a lot of great work on the magic, the pagan tradition in prehistory in England, and also through the early modern period. And he has a little essay on Tolkien and his magic. But otherwise, it's not something that the scholarship has sort of tackled a lot, as far as I could tell, right? And I think it's because we take so literally Tolkien's dismissal of Shakespeare, or that he. Holly Ordway's new book shows his modern reading, but we don't really know what he's reading that Lewis would have known, because Lewis is writing as Lewis called it, Oh Hell, right? The Oxford History of English Literature on the 16th century. This has got to be in Tolkien's.
Let's take one last question.
Okay. I can give bibliography indefinitely, so.
Well, I just wonder, now that, in the time period, so do we know that he had any affiliations with any of the folks like Dion Fortune or any of those other folks, occultists of the era, or? Not
that I'm aware of, but Charles Williams is obviously part of the Inklings group, and he's very, he's too occult for Tolkien apparently, but Lewis was good friends with him. And then on fairy stories, I'm going to sort of censure on this, right? on fairy stories is published in the Essays in Honor of Charles Williams. So I think Tolkien doesn't footnote everything, right? And that's the challenge of reading him. And it's when Travis was talking about how you read widely and, you know, put things into your story that you're not necessarily marking in a way that everybody can know what you're talking about. Obviously, Tolkien read voraciously. So.
Well, thank you very much. Let's have a big round of applause.
Thank you.